know this sort of thing, or whoever told us that was not in a position to know this sort of thing, or we've got other evidence that it's false. The sort of evidence I'm talking about, or the reasons I'm talking about now, are a priori reasons for believing that sentences of particular kinds are more or less probable than the norm. To bring out what these reasons are, I invoke basis theorem. Again, I'm sure to all of you, but I put it on the handout. I assume that where P is some hypothesis, E is some piece of evidence, and K is our background evidence, or in the form of sentences, basis theorem states correctly the posterior probability, B of P on E and K, as a function of the likelihood of H, that's on my handout, and the prior probability of H. Being completely general, basis theorem must hold however we divide the evidence between E and K. If we put all the relevant evidence into E, leave K as an obvious tautology, then P of P on K measures the intrinsic probability of P. I have considered some of the factors which determine intrinsic probabilities of sentences. It follows from basis theorem, the greater the intrinsic probability, the greater the posterior probability, all things, other things being equal. That is the probability which E gives to P. Now let E be the evidence that S has an experiential inclination to believe that P is true. It follows from basis theorem that for any given likelihood, the greater the intrinsic probability, the greater the posterior probability, that is the probability which E gives to P. The likelihood of P will exceed 1 if it's more probable that S will believe P if P is true than if P is false. It is probable that someone's belief, reported by E, will be sensitive to the state of affairs believed, which sorry, a rather long P's got into the formulae, which I agree confuses things, but you're all intelligent people and you can make the difference between a lowercase p and a capital P and a P star. I'm sorry for that, it's confusing. It's probable that someone's belief, reported by E, will be sensitive to the state of affairs believed, P star, reported by lowercase p, if and only if it's probable that the state reported by P star causes, totally or partly, the state reported by E, or the state reported by E causes P star, or they have a common cause. Thank you. My justification for giving this particular lecture under the religious epistemology heading is that, well, Christian religion believes strongly in free will, and many people think that in order to have free will, our actions must not be determined. In particular, it must be the case that physical determinism is false. And I am going to argue that physical determinism is highly implausible, and to do that I am presenting an epistemological thesis. It's possible that some of you may have read what I have to say about this matter, since it does correspond rather closely to a chapter in the book to which John referred. And I'm sorry about that, but I don't know if it will give you an opportunity to raise objections to what I've said with the subsequent discussion. Okay, I hope everyone has a handout. I begin with some definitions which are on the handout. I define a physical event as an event to which no one person has privileged access. That is a public event. And a mental event as to one to which its subject, the person whose it is, necessarily has privileged access. By a person having privileged access to some event, I mean that necessarily he is in a better position than anyone else to know that it is occurring. Whatever ways others have of finding out whether or not it is occurring, the subject can also use. He has an additional way by experiencing it. I define a pure mental event as one which does not entail the occurrence of a physical event. Perceptions, such as my seeing a tree, are mental events, since I can know better than anyone else whether or not I'm seeing a tree. They are not pure mental events, since seeing a tree entails that there is a tree they're present, that is a physical event. But sensations, such as pains and beliefs, such as the belief that I am seeing a tree, are pure mental events, since it is not entailed by the occurrence of sensations or beliefs that anything public is happening. Conscious events are a subclass of pure mental events. They include both those pure mental events which occur only while the subject is conscious of them, and also pure mental events of which the subject is conscious, but which may occur while the subject is not conscious of them. The first group includes not merely sensations, such as pains, but also occurrent thoughts. If I am not in any way aware that the thought, today is Tuesday, is now crossing my mind, it isn't crossing my mind. It also includes, I suggest, as I shall use the term, intentions. That is, the intentions in what I'm doing, not the emptiness. For example, they were caused by a neurophysiologist stimulating that person's neurons to produce the sounds, or simply, as in fluid aphasia, where a neural malfunction causes a stream of words to come out of a subject's mouth. That evidence constitutes an undermining defeat of the belief and the truth of what that person seemed to be saying. Just to repeat, for the last one, testimony. Supposedly testimony, you should believe what I tell you, things being equal. But you assume in trusting testimony that the testimony that's coming out of the subject's mouth is in fact caused by the subject intending that it should come out of their mouth, and their belief that it's true, and that intention and belief, their belief that it's true must itself be caused by a past experience of the event itself. So if you find that one or other of these conditions are not satisfied, then you have no justification for believing the apparent testimony. Right. The intention does, of course, have to be of a particular kind, an intention to tell the truth. Evidence that the person is intending to deceive me would also undermine his testimony. But again, my point is simply that evidence that there is no causation at all by the apparent testifier's intention, belief undermines his apparent testimony. In all of these cases, the counter-evidence, in the form of an undermining defeater, must itself come, directly or indirectly, from apparent experience, memory, or testimony. So, in summary, I am making what I call my epistemic assumption, which is at the bottom of page 1 of the handout. The epistemic assumption is that 1. A justified belief in a scientific theory, which is not as itself a consequence of any higher level theory in which the believer has a justified belief, requires a justified belief that the theory makes true predictions. 2. Justified belief that the theory makes true predictions, unless this is a consequence of some other theory in which the believer has a justified belief. Justified belief that the theory makes true predictions is provided by, and only by, the evidence of apparent experience, memory, and testimony that the theory predicts certain events, that these events occurred. And 3. Such justification is undermined by evidence that any apparent experience was not caused by the event apparently experienced, any apparent memory was not caused by an apparent experience of the event apparently remembered, and any apparent testimony was not caused by the testifier's intention to report this apparent experience or memory. I hope that the few examples by which I have illustrated its application show the centrality of EA, assumption, in our analytic framework. Lying behind EA is what I call a fundamental criterion. This is that justified belief that some event occurred requires the assumption that that event is privilegedly accessible to, or causes effects privilegedly accessible to, the believer, unless it's justifiably believed to be a consequence of some wider theory which predicts events justifiably believed to occur on grounds independent of that theory. Then,
justified belief that the theory makes true predictions requires, unless justified by a higher level theory, the assumption that both the scientist's awareness of the calculations that the theory predicts certain events and the events predicted are accessible, or cause effects accessible to the believer. MC is, I suggest, a criterion central to our judgments about the credibility of a scientific theory. I give you some definitions of the terms, and I presented an epistemological thesis about the requirements, one crucial requirement for the justification of a scientific theory, that it should make predictions, and that we shall justifiably believe that it makes predictions. And this requires certain assumptions about our sources of this belief, that it justifiably makes predictions, and in all cases there is, of course, an assumption. Right, now back again to the topic. There could be two kinds of scientific evidence for epiphenomenalism. The first, which I shall call alpha-type evidence, is evidence about when, relative to brain events, various conscious events occurred. For epiphenomenalism claims that the occurrence of any conscious event makes no difference to the pattern of later brain events. So it predicts that whether or not some type of conscious event occurs during the first part of some sequence of brain events will make no difference to whether or not the sequence is completed and so cause public behavior. It would seem that if this prediction were tested for a large random sample of different kinds of sequences of brain events, different types of conscious events, and found to be correct, this would be strong evidence for epiphenomenalism. Same had evidence that there was innumerable different kinds of sequences of brain events, one brain event causing another, causing inversion to the brain
sort of thing, or whoever told us that is not in a position to know this sort of thing, but other evidence is false. The sort of evidence I'm talking about, or the reasons I'm talking about now, are a priori reasons for believing that sentences of particular kinds are more or less probable than normal. To bring out what these reasons are, I invoke basis theorem. Again, I'm sure to all of you, but I put it on the handout. I assume that where P is some hypothesis, and E is some piece of evidence, K is our background evidence, or in the form of sentences, Bayes' theorem states correctly the posterior probability, B of P on E and K, as a function of the likelihood of H, as on the handout, and the prior probability of H. Being completely general, Bayes' theorem must hold, however we divide the evidence between E and K. If we put all the relevant evidence into E, leave K as an obvious tautology, and P of P on K measures the intrinsic probability of P. I've considered some of the factors which determine intrinsic probabilities of sentences. It follows from Bayes' theorem, the greater the intrinsic probability, the greater the posterior probability of all things. Other things being equal, that is the probability which E gives to P. Now let E be the evidence that S has an experiential inclination to believe that P is true. It follows from Bayes' theorem that for any given likelihood, the greater the intrinsic probability, the greater the posterior probability, that is the probability which E gives to P. The likelihood of P will exceed 1 if it's more probable that S will believe P if P is true than if P is false. It is probable that someone's belief, reported by E, will be sensitive to the state of affairs believed. Sorry, there are rather long P's got into the formulae, which I agree confuses things, but people make the difference between a lowercase p and a capital P and a P star. I'm sorry for that, it's confusing. It's probable that someone's belief, reported by E, will be sensitive to the state of affairs believed, P star, reported by lowercase p. if and only if it's probable that the state reported by P star causes, totally or partly, the state reported by E, or the state reported by E causes P star, or they have a common cause. Considering
events occurred whether or not someone performed the intention to induce or the movement caused by this, but this didn't make any difference to it. If you had lots of evidence of that kind, it might seem that you would have good evidence of phenomenalism. To get that sort of evidence, to test such predictions, the scientist would have to learn about the times of occurrence of various conscious events. Know when the event occurred. Paradigm way to learn about this is from apparent experience, memory, and testimony about when the conscious events occurred. Although a scientist could learn about the times of occurrence of conscious events of some narrow kind from some wider theory, that theory would be a theory about when conscious events of some wider kind occurred, could itself be justifiably believed only on evidence of the same kind. Yet if apparent testimony is to constitute evidence that conscious events occurred, the scientist must, by my principle EA, assume that the testifying subjects are caused to say what they do by a belief that the conscious events occurred, and an intention to tell the truth about their belief, a causal route which must go through a brain event. But if epiphenomenalism were true, no conscious events would cause any brain events to cause the subjects to say what they do. So, you've got to have evidence of this, evidence of this. Well, you can get this from experience, memory, testimony, and this but we'll learn about it by the objective world, but that would mean that this does make a difference to some events. So, the situation is there's this way of trying to establish phenomenalism looks self-defeating. No theory could be justifiably believed on the basis of evidence about the occurrence of events, about the occurrence of which we could have evidence only if we assume the theory to be false. Hence, epiphenomenalism couldn't be justifiably believed on the basis of apparent testimony of the subjects to the events. Scientist might remember his own conscious events. By EA, someone is justified in trusting his apparent memories on the assumption that they are caused by his past experiences. But we know that all true memories, except perhaps ones of events within the previous few minutes, are caused immediately by brain events. So, in order to be justified in believing that his memories are caused more ultimately by his past experiences, he must believe that those experiences cause brain events, and so he must assume that epiphenomenalism as a whole is false. He gets his belief about his past intention by some present belief that it occurred, this is a memory of it. Then the only way this is going to happen, yes, is that this is going to cause brain trace which will cause the present memory. That again involves brain events. Scientists might, yes. Hence, apparent memories of past experiences cannot provide a justified belief that epiphenomenalism makes true predictions any more than can apparent testimony of others. Perhaps a scientist might have a justified belief about which conscious event he was currently experiencing, without assuming that the conscious events caused that belief. I have suggested normally we might be justified in supposing that our beliefs about our conscious events are caused by them, but some philosophers have argued that they're not, and it doesn't matter very much to my position whether or not that's true. Because even if someone might know on the basis of their own present experience experience what they are experiencing without there being any causation of any mental event by anything else, then that would hardly be enough evidence for the scientist to know either what his theory predicts or whether the predicted events had occurred. So I conclude that no one could have a justified belief in epiphenomenalism on the basis of what I call type alpha evidence for it. Alpha evidence is of the occurrence of certain mental events during some sequence of brain events. I now apply this result to the research program initiated by Benjamin Libet, which seeks to provide evidence of type alpha, showing, that is to say, providing a justified belief, that a sample of brain events of one kind which cause intentional actions are not caused by intentions. The original and most influential Libet experiments, participants were instructed to move their hand at a moment of their choice within a period, say 20 seconds. So choose freely at some time in the next 20 seconds to move your hand. They watch a very fast clock and report subsequently the moment at which they first had the intention, or whatever, I'll come to that in a moment, the moment at which they had first had the intention to move the hand. They reported the intention occurred on average 200 milliseconds before the onset of muscle activity initiating a hand. They are asked to move their hand at some time in the next seconds and to report subsequently when they formed the intention to do so. And in for the event, the intention. And the general result of this is that scientists found that there was an interval of 500 milliseconds here, for the 60 minute, and for of 100 milliseconds here. That brain blip caused the body to move milliseconds after the time which science subject said they thought intention. But then it was also found that some 500 milliseconds before that, there was a build-up of potential on the subject's skull, to which various specific electrical apparatus can be applied. And presumably this indicated some sort of brain blip going on, and one. So there was evidence that when there was a particular kind of event happening in the brain, that, which was followed by the intention, which was followed by that. Okay. Now, many neuroscientists, believe it or not, proceed from that to reach the extraordinary conclusion that the intention doesn't cause the movement. Thus, I'll quote one recent collection of articles on this. An article by three neuroscientists conclude that, quote, Libet's data contradict the naive view of free will that conscious intention causes action. Clearly, conscious intention cannot cause an action if a neural event that precedes and correlates with the action comes before the conscious intention. So they were saying that can't cause that because there's a correlation between that and that. But that, of course, is a totally unjustified conclusion, since it's equally compatible with all the data and the most natural explanation of them to suppose that B1 causes M2, which in turn causes M3. Causation is transitive. If I flip the light switch and thereby cause the light bulb to light up, that doesn't rule out the possibility that by flipping the switch caused an electric current to pass to the bulb, that the current caused the bulb to light up. Despite this obvious point, many neuroscientists prefer one of two rival explanations of the data over the natural explanation, and the favored one of the two rival explanations is that the earlier brain event causes both the intention by one route and the sequence of brain events by is. Now, if it were shown, so this kind of experiment, and the original Liberty experiments have been made a lot more sophisticated in various ways, and the scientists have much better access to what's going on in the brain than they did in the original experiments trying to get to the information of the brain. That doesn't make any difference to the general form of such experimental results. Find no level potential before certain things happen. But this is suggesting absolutely nothing about the cause and root. To show something about the cause and root, you need an experiment of this type. But then, even if it were shown that D1 causes a sequence of brain events which are necessary for the bodily movement, when that constitutes an intentional action, that wouldn't show that the intention was not a necessary part of the cause. To show that, you would need to show that B1 causes the same sequence of brain events with or without subjects having the requisite intention, so with or without the bodily movement constituting an intentional action. As far as I know, no one has attempted to show this. If it were shown, we would have evidence against the natural interpretation of the living experiment. Evidence that this causes this and this causes that by different routes. Experimenters seeking to establish a scientific theory, such as those performing Libet-type experiments, assume they have access to the conscious lives of many different subjects, and so type alpha evidence about them, in order to test the prediction discussed in the this prediction that that sequence would occur with or without the intention. In order to test the prediction that the same sequence of brain events would occur in the absence of the intention, without which the experimental results do not show, so far, do not show the intention does not cause the movement. Again, my general points I made earlier to this particular possible experiment that might be done. The only way for experimenters to acquire this information, the information about when this occurred and show to do that experiment, the only way for experimenters to acquire this information about the conscious events of subjects is from what those subjects tell them. Theory is their consequence. So experimenters assume that the subjects' beliefs about their conscious events are correlated with their testimony, in the sense that the testimony is a true report of their beliefs. The normal reason for this is provided by the subject's intention to tell the truth about their beliefs, plus their beliefs cause the testimony. If we assume that the correlation holds for this reason, we would already be assuming the falsity of epiphenomenalism in one respect, in order to test the crucial prediction necessary to provide justification of either of the interpretations of the Libet experiments, which claim that intentions do not cause the hand movement. We can only justifiably believe that intentions do not cause the hand movements if we justifiably believe that they do cause the apparent testimony about them. However, this is not to rule out the possibility that in the particular circumstances of Libet-type experiments, apparent testimony is not caused by the intention to produce it. And that could only be the case if in general apparent testimony was reliable, and so normally apparent testimony is caused by the intention to produce it. So yes, certain experiments might show that in certain restricted kind of circumstances, testimony is not caused by the intention, that our hand movements or whatever are not caused by the intention that they should. But this could only be the case that it proved that for a particular narrow kind of experiment on the assumption that it normally doesn't hold. That is to say, its nature is such that it can't be extrapolated widely. So, I conclude that the Libet-type experiments have not so far shown that even in their experimental circumstances, intentions do not cause bodily movements. And even if the crucial predictions necessary to show this were correct, that would only show that epiphenomenalism held in these particular circumstances on the assumption that in general it was false. And more generally, no alpha-type evidence could possibly have any tendencies whatever to show that epiphenomenalism generally is false. And therefore, you couldn't have any tendency to show that physical determinism is true. It might, however, seem that someone could have a justified belief in physical determinism, not because of type alpha evidence for epiphenomenalism, but because of a justified belief in some physical theory that every physical event has another physical event as its immediate, necessary, and sufficient causal condition. In that case, of course, no brain event could have a conscious event as its necessary causal condition, because if all the necessary causal conditions are at this level, then whether or not intentions occur would be irrelevant. So the suggestion might be, okay, let's see if we can construct a physical deterministic theory by finding from all sorts of physical events, including, of course, brain events,
Just as I shall use the term intentions.
That is the intentions in what I'm doing, not the intentions in the future. Intentions, what I am trying to achieve by my bodily movements. If my body performs some movement of a kind which I normally make intentionally, but which on this occasion was simply an unintended reflex, then, as I am using the term, there was no intention in what I am doing. Among the pure mental events of which I can become conscious, but which may continue to occur while I'm not conscious of them, are beliefs and desires. That's all terminology. Physical determinism, as I shall understand it, is the doctrine that every event has a physical event as its necessary and sufficient cause, and no non-physical event as a cause. It therefore entails epiphenomenalism, the doctrine that physical events, in effect brain events, cause conscious events, but conscious events, including intentions, never cause physical events. Hence, if epiphenomenalism is implausible, so too is physical determinism. It would follow from epiphenomenalism that such common sense views as that my intention to come to the humanities building caused the brain events which caused my leg movements which brought me here are false. In this paper, I argue the epistemological thesis that no one could ever be justified in believing physical determinism, that claims that recent neuroscientific work provide that justification are not merely false, but couldn't possibly be true, and that is because of what constitutes a justified belief in a scientific theory. For a justified belief in physical determinism requires a justified belief in a particular deterministic scientific theory, and to have a justified belief in a scientific theory requires a justified belief that it makes successful predictions. And that means both a justified belief that it predicts certain events and a justified belief that those events occurred. And I am going to argue those justified beliefs, the ones I've just mentioned, couldn't possibly be had if physical determinism is true. Hence, I shall argue, physical determinism is self-defeating. It could only be justified if the fact is false. So, I start with epistemology. How can anyone have a justified belief that some scientific theory predicts certain events? The scientists in the relevant field will have calculated that it makes these predictions. And if a scientist can hold all the calculations in her mind at one time, it will be for her a deliverance of reason, evident a priori, that the theory does make these predictions. Alas, for any scientific theory of any complexity, most experts at the center of the field will be unable to hold in their minds at one time all the relevant calculations. Even as the scientist reads through the text of her calculations, She depends on her memory towards the end of the calculations for her belief that the initial calculations were correct. Later in life, all that she may remember is that it did seem to her earlier that the theory made those predictions. She may have a diary in which she has recorded this, which will be, as it were, her testimony about this to herself and others. Non-scientists and scientists less central in the field will depend on the testimony of those whom they regard as experts, that they have made those calculations. So what makes someone's belief that the theory predicts certain events justified is, if it can be had, experience, one currently seeing that the calculations are correct, memory of having made the calculations of the past, and testimony from oneself or others that they have made certain calculations. Or rather, since all of these sources may mislead, it is apparent memory, apparent experience, memory and testimony which provide our justified belief that the theory makes true predictions. Justified in the absence of counter-evidence, that is, the absence of defeaters. So that's how anyone can have a justified belief that a theory makes certain predictions. And how can anyone have a justified belief that the events predicted in fact occurred? They will normally depend on the evidence of the same three sources. Certain observers will apparently, in a wide sense, experience these events. That is, if they are physical events, they will perceive them. If they are conscious events, they will experience them in a narrow sense. Later, the observers may apparently remember having experienced the events, and others will depend on the apparent testimony of observers about these, or the observers may depend on their own apparent testimony. Alternatively, a believer may have a justified belief that the events predicted occurred because it's a consequence, deductive or probabilistic, of some other justifiably believed theory that they did. But in that case, the justified belief in the other theory would itself depend on the evidence of the same three sources. It is a fundamental epistemic principle that what we seem to, that is, what we apparently experience, is probably so, barring counter-evidence. This includes what we seem to observe in the public world, what we seem to experience as conscious events, and the logical consequences that we seem to see. We believe all of these in the absence of counter-evidence. This I call the principle of credulity. If this were not a fundamental epistemic principle, total skepticism would follow. It is a second epistemic principle, which in fact follows from the former, though I shall find it useful to treat it separately. Second epistemic principle, that what we seem to, that is, what we apparently remember having experienced, we probably did experience, barring counter-evidence. I call this the principle of memory. And it's a further epistemic principle that what people seem to, that is, apparently, are telling us that they experienced, they probably did experience, again, barring counter-evidence. I call this the principle of testimony. Beliefs acquired by apparent experience, memory, and testimony are probably true in the absence of counter-evidence. Science relies on the applicability of these principles to determine what constitutes evidence. A scientist takes his apparent observations, experiences, and calculations as probably correct, at least when he's looked carefully and checked. Almost all scientific knowledge relies on apparent memory, for example, of the results of experiments or calculations only written up on the following day. And for all science, we rely most of the time on the apparent testimony, written and spoken, of observers who have had certain experiences, normally in the form of observations, and of theoreticians who have done certain calculations. And the wider public relies entirely on the apparent testimony of scientists, both with respect to their calculations and to their experiences. Beliefs acquired by apparent experience, memory, and testimony are, however, open to counter-evidence or defeaters. There are two kinds of defeaters: undermining defeaters and overriding defeaters. If we have inferred, consciously or subconsciously, the occurrence of some event Y from present evidence X, then an undermining defeater, y, is evidence making it probable that x did not occur, or is not good evidence for y, whereas an overriding defeater is new evidence that y did not happen. If, for example, I apparently experience hearing my telephone ring, and then someone points out to me that the noise, in which I subconsciously inferred that the telephone was ringing, is in fact coming from the television set, where someone is depicted as hearing a telephone ring, that constitutes an undermining defeater for my apparent experience. It doesn't show that my telephone was not ringing, but it does show that the noise was not evidence that it was, because the noise had a different cause.
It's more probable that S will believe P if P is true and if P is false. It is probable that someone's belief, reported by E, will be sensitive to the state of affairs believed. Sorry, a rather long P's got into the formulae, which I agree confuses things, but there are all intelligent people and you can make the difference between a lowercase p and a capital P and a P star. Sorry for that, it's confusing. It's probable that someone's belief, reported by E, will be sensitive to the state of affairs believed, P star, reported by lowercase p. If and only if it's probable that the state reported by P star causes, totally or partly, the state reported by E, or the state reported by E causes P star, or they have a common cause. Considering